The wildcard envelope was opened, and in that moment, Australian tennis chose nostalgia over noise, legacy over controversy, and one final goodbye over one last gamble. But was this really about rewarding Stan Wawrinka? Or was it quietly about closing the Nick Kyrgios chapter without saying his name out loud? Because the Australian Open didn't just hand out a wild card, it sent a message. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why this decision could reshape how tennis handles legends, rebels, and farewells forever. Here's the value for you right now. This isn't just news. This is a story about endings, about how champions are remembered, about why one man gets a final walk onto Rod Laver Arena while another is told, politely, to wait. And hidden inside this wildcard announcement is a truth about modern tennis that fans are only just starting to notice. Stan Wawrinka is 40 years old. Let that sink in. 40. In a sport that chews up bodies before 30, where careers are now measured in data, durability, and downtime, Stanimal is still here, still grinding, still loading up that one-handed backhand like it's 2014 all over again. And now, officially, 2026 has been declared his final season. No ambiguity, no, we'll see how the body feels. This is it, the last chapter. When Tennis Australia handed him an Australian Open wildcard, it wasn't because of his ranking. World number 156 doesn't usually get you a golden ticket into a Grand Slam main draw. It wasn't because of recent results either. Wawrinka hasn't lifted a trophy since Geneva in 2017. 7 long years. In tennis time, that's a lifetime ago. This wildcard was about something else entirely. Memory. Because Melbourne Park is where Stan Wawrinka stopped being the other Swiss guy and became a Grand Slam champion. Australian Open 2014. Rafael Nadal on the other side of the net. A fearless performance. Backhands exploding off the baseline. No intimidation. No hesitation. Just raw belief. That night didn't just change Stan's career. It changed tennis history. It proved that even in the era of Federer, Nadal, and Djokovic, there was room for a fourth man to kick the door down. That's the Stan Wawrinka tennis Australia is honoring, not the current ranking, not the injury list, the legacy. And listen to Wawrinka's own words. He didn't talk about deserving anything. He talked about gratitude, about how winning that first Grand Slam in Melbourne remains the highlight of his career, about how starting his final year at the Australian Open means the world to him. Those aren't empty quotes. That's a player fully aware that the end is near, choosing to embrace it instead of running from it. But here's where the story takes a turn, because for every wild card given, there's a name missing, and this time, that name is impossible to ignore. Nick Kyrgios, Australian, former Wimbledon finalist, former world number 13. A player who has sold more tickets, drawn more headlines, and divided more opinion than almost anyone of his generation. And yet, when the wild card list came out, his name wasn't there. At first glance, fans assumed the worst. Was this Tennis Australia finally closing the door on Kyrgios after years of chaos, controversy, and what-ifs? Was this punishment? Politics? A quiet falling out? But then Kyrgios spoke, and what he said changed everything. I'd rather give my spot to someone ready to make it count. That single sentence tells you more about where Nick Kyrgios is right now than 1,000 press conferences ever could. This wasn't Tennis Australia rejecting Kyrgios. This was Kyrgios stepping back. After years of injuries, setbacks, wrist surgeries, knee issues, and endless stops and starts, Nick Kyrgios looked at the Australian Open men's singles draw and made a brutally honest assessment. 5-set tennis is a different beast, and he's not ready for it. Not yet. Let's be clear. This is the same Nick Kyrgios who once said he didn't train like others, who mocked the grind, who played on instinct and talent. For him to publicly admit that his body isn't ready to go, the distance is not weakness. It's maturity. And ironically, it might be the most responsible decision of his entire career. Instead of forcing a comeback fueled by hype and expectation, Kyrgios chose doubles. The format he's already conquered. The event he won in 2022 alongside Thanasi Kokkinakis. Shorter matches, less physical punishment, more joy, more sustainability. I'm fit and back on court, Kyrgios said, but 5-setters are a different beast. That line matters because it tells us something uncomfortable about modern tennis. Singles doesn't wait for you. Not even if you're the biggest star in the country. Not even if you sell out stadiums. The body has to be ready. The mind has to be ready. And if they're not, the sport moves on. So now we have two men at opposite ends of their careers, crossing paths without ever sharing the same court. Stan Wawrinka, 40 years old, knowing this is the final lap, receiving one last invitation to the place where his legend was born. Nick Kyrgios, 30 years old, still young by normal standards, yet already fighting the reality of a body that won't cooperate, choosing patience over pride. And that contrast is what makes this wildcard decision so powerful, because Tennis Australia could have gone the other way. They could have handed Kyrgios a wildcard purely for headlines, for ticket sales, for the chaos factor. They could have framed it as a comeback story. Australia's bad boy returns home, the prodigal son. The drama writes itself. But they didn't. Instead, they chose certainty over spectacle, legacy over lottery. And that raises a bigger question for the future of tennis. Are we entering an era where wildcards are no longer about potential, but about closure? Think about it. Rafael Nadal, Andy Murray, Stan Wawrinka. These players defined an era. As they approach retirement, tournaments aren't just giving them entry. They're giving fans a chance to say goodbye. One last roar. One last walk onto center court. One last moment. And fans want that. Desperately. Because tennis is changing fast. New champions. New rivalries. New personalities. But nostalgia still sells. Emotion still matters. And there's something deeply human about knowing you're watching the end of something special. That's what Stan Wawrinka represents in Melbourne this year. Not a contender, not a favorite, but a reminder. A reminder of what courage looks like when you stare down Rafael Nadal in a Grand Slam final and don't blink. A reminder of what it means to peak late, to believe when others doubt, to carve out greatness in the shadow of giants. And that's why this wild card matters more than any first-round result ever could. Because win or lose, Wawrinka's presence turns the Australian Open into a farewell tour moment. Every match becomes a memory. Every point carries weight. Meanwhile, Nick Kyrgios, watching from the doubles court, sends a different message. One about patience, about rebuilding, about understanding your limits instead of denying them. And here's the curiosity gap that matters. What happens next? Does Kyrgios return next year, fully fit, ready to reclaim his place in singles? Or does this moment mark the quiet acceptance that his career may never fully return to what it once promised? And when Wawrinka finally walks off the court in Melbourne for the last time, will we realize too late how rare players like him truly are? Because careers don't end with fireworks anymore. They fade, slowly, quietly, between injuries and rankings and wildcards. And maybe that's the real story here. Not that Stan Wawrinka got a wild card, not that Nick Kyrgios didn't, but that tennis, once again, reminded us how brutal time can be and how precious these final moments are. Now I want to hear from you, TennisZap community. Was giving Stan Wawrinka this Australian Open wildcard the right call, even with Nick Kyrgios stepping aside? Or should wildcards always be about the future, not the past? Let me know what you think in the comments, because this debate is far from over.